Welcome, Bilal. Really excited to be here first of all, thank you to Ali for connecting us and creating this forum for us to, and for Park Launch for creating this forum for us to get together and be able to have a casual conversation about your candidacy for state assembly in California. And welcome to everybody here who's joining. Thank you for your Saturday morning. See, I still got my coffee. And I'm trying to figure out which weekend morning it is. For your Saturday morning here in the US, Pacific, and your Saturday night in Pakistan. And then I think we have some folks from the East Coast. So we appreciate your time here. So I met Bilal through Ali. We got introduced via a chat, and then we talked about his assembly race. I was very interested because it is in the San Francisco Bay Area. It is a very important seat, I think, in San Francisco that it has a lot of impact. And so I talked to Bilal, and I think he's really got a great strategy and campaign. I think that's a winning strategy if everything lines up. So I wanted to start off by asking Bilal to introduce yourself a little bit. Who you are, where did you grow up, where did you go to school, all the fun stuff we want to know about you as a person.
Sure. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks, Sabina, for the introduction, Ali, for hosting us as well. But yeah, happy to share a little bit more about context myself and why we're running. Like Sabina mentioned, this is a very important race that is going to impact not just San Francisco and California, but I think sets a precedent for much of the country as we're going through a transition here over time. My name is Bilal Mahmood. I'm a civil servant, entrepreneur. I've worked across a variety of industries and sectors, but I think a lot of the inspiration for why I'm running stems from my family's background and heritage. My parents immigrated here 35, 40 years ago from Pakistan, from Lahore. But I think as many people on this call can relate to, the story of my family is one of immigration and constant strife between different countries. Ethnically, 4 generations ago, my family is Kashmiri. Obviously, that country doesn't really exist anymore. 3 generations ago, the British worked to move my great-grandparents to Nairobi, where they were working on the railroads. That was another common story in a lot of our heritage that people don't talk about. And then partition happened, moved to the Punjab, and then eventually my parents moved here. And I think another element of that striking is that my last name is made up. Every generation of my family, we went from Khwajas to Qureishis to Mahmoods, as was common as the new countries were created, or they had to move to different lands to get land ownership, would take on the name of the area that they were moving to. And so I think that, especially for a lot of Pakistanis who immigrated to the States, that journey of immigration and culture and heritage is something that has been lost a lot along the way. And I think is just deeply important to the San Francisco and the Bay Area journey as well. My parents came here because, and I think for many still, San Francisco, California represent a beacon of hope for immigrants in the middle class. That's what it was for my parents when they moved here. When we started off, there was 3 generations of us in a single family home when we started. And we moved to the Bay Area, and that was necessary to ensure that we'll be able to move into the middle class. We went to the best public schools because my mom fought to get us there. She would take public transit every day to ensure we made it there. My mom eventually became a librarian. My dad became a technologist, and they became deeply rooted in the community in the Bay Area through MCA and different. They ran a Stanford Islamic school, and so a lot of those things kind of like rooted us in the community. But I think one thing that was also really important for my upbringing growing up was that my mom and dad never let us forget where we came from and always paying it forward. And so my mom would be housing other Pakistani immigrants who were trying to move to the country growing up, and then also helping refugees and immigrants from Bosnia and Kosovo. So I think for me, and that kind of like translates directly into what this campaign means and what we're trying to help recover in San Francisco and California, which is that our city and our state used to represent a beacon of hope for immigrants, for the middle class. That middle class was the exact experience that my parents had, which was necessary through housing, schools, and transit. And those things have disappeared. I firmly believe that if my parents came here today, they wouldn't make it. It's too expensive, and it's not safe, and the schools are really bad at this point. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is recover that. Personally, as a career, I focused over the last decade on trying to tackle that from different elements. So I worked for President Obama in the Small Business Administration and Department of Commerce to actually address small business policy, because at the root of most of the experience is small businesses. I worked on nonprofits that helped thousands of individuals get microlending services internationally and domestically, predominantly for female entrepreneurs in the developing world. And then I built my own technology company, which we sold to Amplitude, which went public. I'm wearing the Amplitude t-shirt auspiciously. But we helped tens of thousands of businesses get access to technology for free, sold the company, went public, and then transitioned back into policy, because I felt that the challenges we face ahead are really going to be solved by policy. And I think that's kind of like the unique thing about our race and our candidacy is there hasn't really been someone who's been both a scientist, technologist, and a policy person in the same campaign actually executing policy. But also we'd be the first Pakistani elected to the state. We'd be the first Muslim elected to the state, we'd be the second South Asian. And I think all those things really matter, because the issues that we're fighting for require courage to actually act on them. And it requires people who have experience, both the public and the private sector, to advocate for them as well. And that's a lot of what our campaign represents.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think you already answered my next question, but maybe you can go a little bit deeper. Why did you decide to run?
Yeah, I think it was a lot of evolution of the process over the last year. So while I had worked previously for President Obama as an analyst, I had, like I mentioned, transitioned a lot more to the private sector, both in nonprofits and technology. And it was an evolution of thought over the last year. I think I'd started a foundation last year to help with workers who were impacted due to COVID in the pandemic and who'd lost their jobs. I'd helped to reduce anti-Asian violence through nonprofit work that we were doing as well. I was volunteering on safety patrols in the community. The amount of anti-Asian violence had spiked over the last year, and it's continuing to get worse. Even just last week, the first mosque in San Francisco had a beer bottle thrown into it. And this case against issues against immigrants and Asian population, Pakistani population, Muslim population has been getting worse. And the more I evaluated it was that at the nonprofit level, it's really important work, but really systemic change is only going to happen through policy. And everything that happened in the pandemic, I think, was a wake-up call that I needed to focus back on local politics rather than national politics, where housing prices were up, the number of unhoused and people who were homeless in San Francisco was going up, the opioid deaths were worse, anti-Asian violence was worse. Those 300 hate crimes last year and counting that still have not been charged or prosecuted. And so a lot of these components were reasons that kind of like drew me as an impetus to run in this context. And also just the facet that like, we have so little time left to solve these problems. Climate change is getting worse, that affects everywhere all across the country. We had, I think, one minor note was that when we had the fires here in San Francisco and in California, in the Bay Area, my first reaction was like, wow, this is bad. But the second was like, this smells like Lahore. And what that, I never associated that, but what made me realize is that Lahore smells like smog. And the AQI index, obviously in Lahore, is extremely bad and very unhealthy due to pollution. And it just made me realize that like climate is something that's affected so much of the world's population, and it's going to affect those countries before it affects the United States. And the reason, and it just kind of like bridged those things together, that climate is a universal problem that has a ticking time bomb to solve, and it's going to affect international populations much before it affects the states. And the time is so little left to address these problems that we needed to act now, because no one else was doing it.
Thank you for sharing that. So one of the questions that we were also talking about earlier is that running a campaign is very different than when you govern. And how are you, how is your campaign structured? How are you running? What is your, kind of strategy, win strategy for the election, which is, as you mentioned, is in February?
Yeah. So yeah, a couple of components, I think. And I think the beauty of this campaign is that we're bringing in a lot of people who don't traditionally engage in politics. We're staffed by political teams that have worked on the mayor of San Francisco's campaigns and other state senators who've won. So they're the best in the business. But we've merged it with other people in technology and in art and design. Our brand in art was created by a world-renowned Asian American artist. A lot of our technology was built by data scientists that I've worked with previously to identify who's the most likely voters that we need to reach and focus our attention there. And so I really view that one of our winning strategies is that we're bridging together different worlds that traditionally didn't get involved. Because if you distill down what is a campaign, it's a giant marketing operation. You're basically, you have a website, you have content, you have message, you're on social media, you're getting out in front of voters, you're trying to convey a message to individuals and both build awareness and then also convince them. You work at Oracle, that's kind of like what you're trying to do all the time. And so it's just at a larger scale. And the primary difference is just there's a lot of in-person communication as well. Second is that we've built a broad coalition. If you look at the people who turn out as volunteers, across different backgrounds, ethnicities, different religious backgrounds as well. But what you're seeing is, like, I've been engaged in community. There's like Pakistani Americans who are engaged in this. Like, I haven't felt this excited about a race before because I hadn't seen myself in this component. So many of my volunteers and the people on our staff are Asian American, especially the younger generation. Who don't feel that someone is fighting. I'm the youngest person in the race as well. And even though I don't necessarily look it, but a lot of that bridging that component of these people who've been upset at the system for so far. A lot of parents are upset about what's happening in the school system here, public schools. A lot of Asian Americans are upset about the anti-Asian violence spiking that has not been held accountable. And I think people are looking for change. And I think that is kind of like the grassroots movement that we feel we're bringing into this race. In terms of kind of like tactical win, I think it's actually a really brilliant race to be a part of because, like we mentioned, it's a special election, which is very different, very weird. It's going to happen in 3 months. The primary where you win is, in this context, is a top 2 primary. So even though we're an outsider in this race, we're going up against the political establishment that has been here for decades. We've already raised over $300,000 in the first month, which is more than the competition has raised. I think that's a testament to the people who we're bringing in that I've worked with previously, as well as the new folks who are really upset. But also, like, our strategy is kind of like, we think we can get in the top 2 because the people in the race have been in the system for so long. They come from the same side of San Francisco politics. They're going to split a lot of their original support. And we're already seeing that in endorsements. Like, there's a pretty big endorsement that was supposed to happen yesterday. The vote got split and there was no endorsement. And so it's very tactically a very interesting race to be a part of because traditional party members are going to be split and it allows for a third party member to come in from the side. But also people are tired of career politicians, I think, especially in the city. And that's kind of like a lot of the things that we're thinking about and we're seeing resonance around as well.
Yeah, so I think that's a huge win that you were able to split that and not get anybody endorsed, because there are some candidates, like you mentioned in that race, which have very much been part of the, part of the process and part of the party. And, that was, I guess that was, whether the party was going to go and endorse somebody who's been in leadership roles there. And the fact that they did not is, I think, a great win for somebody who's coming in new and bringing in a new perspective.
Yeah.
So you did mention, right, you started your own tech company. And how do you tie in the experience of building a tech company, scaling it, and then bringing that experience into this campaign and scaling it at a similar way?
Yeah, in a couple of ways. I'll answer in the context of, like, we touched a little bit upon like how there's a lot of similarities between running a tech company and then running a political campaign. And then there's also similarities, I think, in terms of why it's important to have that experience going into governance. On the former, when you're running a tech company as a co-founder or CEO, like I was, you're really just doing three things over and over again. You're fundraising, you're recruiting, and you're figuring out messaging and building a product to convey that to users. It's very similar in a campaign. You're fundraising constantly. You are building a brand and trying to message it to people. And then 3, you're recruiting volunteers and trying to build capacity and create a team and a movement to enforce change. So from a campaign perspective, I'd say a lot of founders and entrepreneurs could also be very good politicians if they wanted to be. And I think a part of our campaign is like 10% of our city works in tech. A lot of the people who are engaging in our campaign have never engaged in local politics before. They're engineers, they're marketers, they're designers, customer success folks. And they're really finding it energizing to be involved in this campaign because they see like, wow, my skill sets are actually really valid. And I can make a huge impact for a good cause in this context as well. I think in terms of governance, why this experience is important is there's a variety of factors. Let's take climate, for instance. In California, because of legislators and a government that doesn't understand technology, there's a company that I know well called Charm. They can't get their technology approved for carbon sequestration in agriculture because the system is so antiquated, it doesn't understand it. But they can go to other states and get it approved immediately. And that's because we don't have people who understand government. Another example that you're probably familiar with, Sabina, is EDD, the unemployment, the software platform that people would use in California to file for unemployment benefits was basically down all of last year. That's a software and an organizational problem because a lot of people in government have never worked on a software product to know how to operate it effectively. And so if we don't have experience like that to bring into government, most of the world is run by technology at this point. And if we don't have politicians and civil servants who understand how technology works, it's unfortunately, for better or for worse, affecting all parts of society. How can we effectively leverage it or regulate it to ensure that it's meeting the outcomes that it needs to for society?
Great example. I think there are so many things which, we are Silicon Valley's essentially is the heart of innovation. And yet when it comes to government, we've lagged behind so many other states, which may not be the heart of innovation, which is very surprising because of that. We've kept the politicians on one side, we've got the techies on the other side. The techies pay the taxes, the politicians spend the taxes.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons, right, when I was running too, was it got frustrating to a point that where is that level of sometimes, intelligence to understand that we've got to give people the same experience in government that they're expecting in their everyday lives. And why can we not? And I'm sure, along with yourself, you bring a network of people who, as your advisors, who can kind of be your team to help you stay tapped in what's going on. So one of the things I should have probably asked sooner rather than later is, what is the lay of the land, right? What parts of San Francisco do you cover? What is the population size? How many people vote in this election? And
so it's the east side of San Francisco, which covers mostly some of the densest areas in the city. So there's about 300,000 registered voters on that side. On average, about 200,000 vote in a general election. Given it's off cycle and be a primary, we expect probably 100,000 people will vote. The nature of this election is interesting because by demographics, it's roughly like 30% Asian American, not necessarily of those who vote, but 40% white, and like 20% Latin, and then the rest is a mix of folks. The areas are very different. You have skyscrapers and condos. You have single room occupancy hotels. You have single family homes on the western side of it. So it's a very mix of different demographics of people. Majority of the people who live here are renters rather than homeowners on the east side of the district. So it's a very mix of very different demographics and races and creeds and beliefs. So it's a very interesting district for people to kind of like run in and build a coalition. The another facet I think is here that is interesting is that the nature of the race in terms of who's in it and who's going to vote, the issues people care about then range based on where they are in the district. Some of the things we've seen come up is everyone is universally kind of concerned about homelessness. I live 2 blocks from the Tenderloin, which is kind of sad because like growing up, we grew up in the South Bay and San Francisco to us was the Tenderloin. For those who live in the Bay Area, I'm sure a lot of us have been to Shalimar on Jones in the Tenderloin. For those who don't know, it's actually the first Pakistani restaurant in the entire Bay Area. It was started by, it's an amazing story. It was started by a couple of cab drivers who just wanted to eat their own food. So they set up this hole in the wall joint to kind of eat themselves. And then people like my parents would come there and be like, okay, let's start a restaurant. So almost every other weekend, we would come up there. We would come to San Francisco just to go to this restaurant. And it's still in the Tenderloin, it's still amazing food. But if you visit there, it's a vestige of what it once was. So many of the businesses around it have closed. There's tent encampments all around. The opiate epidemic is so prevalent. It's kind of shocking what's happened there. And I think that's one of the issues that a lot of people are concerned about as well as rising crime happening as well. And I think the issues that are relevant on the ground are what we're seeing. I was actually going to the restaurant recently, and one of the other amazing things about Shalimar is the prices haven't changed in almost 30 years. It's like the Costco of Pakistani food. But actually, he said, the owner was telling me that they finally changed pricing last year because of the pandemic. It was the first time in like 30 years they ever changed pricing. And it just kind of shows how much the stakes are really high at this point for our community and for that experience. And that's a lot of why we're fighting for this campaign is we need leadership that represents that, understands that, to advocate for change in that context as well.
With the whole redistrict process, are any of your lines going to move or?
Not for this election. So okay. One of the other interesting things about this election is that there's going to be 4 elections in 1 year.
Oh, wow.
So because it's a special, because someone else stepped down, there'll be a special primary and then a special runoff. So special primary, the top 2 go on to the runoff, which will then be in April. And then there'll be a normal primary on the normal election in June. And for that June election, the lines will be redrawn. And so in that election, it's going to very much shift. So a lot of the southeast portion will be cut and the northwest portion will be added of the city. So it will change significantly.
So you will have a primary, like a special primary, and then people in the regular primary, you'll again go through the top 2.
Yes.
I mean, other people can run again. So the same people and more people could potentially run again.
Theoretically, yes.
Okay. That's
it'll be a long year.
Oh my God. Yeah, that is a long year for you. So, and it can get tough. So, it's a good thing you have family support. Obviously, you have this group here, which I'm hoping everybody will provide the support that you need, because I think as a candidate, you need that emotional and encouragement continuously throughout the process as well, to just continue to run the marathon, right? So I will go to some of the questions that are being put in the chat. The first one I saw was about Kylie Rittenhouse. Are you familiar with that or?
Yes, what about it?
It's like, how will you get justice for the victims of Kylie Rittenhouse?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty distressing to see that yesterday. So for those who aren't familiar, Kyle Rittenhouse was the shooter in Kenosha who brought an assault rifle to a protest and killed 2 people. And I think it's offensive. I was reflecting on this. He was 17 years old. Granted, it seems the prosecution did a really bad job at that case. But I have another 17-year-old in Trayvon Martin who was murdered, and his murderer was let free. So I think it very speaks to that this country is a system of two economic justice systems, criminal justice systems, one for people of color and one for people with white privilege. And it's damning that this result happened. Obviously, if you look at the case, it's clear that the prosecution did a really bad job. But it's damning that the result was the same way in this context as well. And unfortunately, in the state, this isn't something we can really do much about, given this was in Kenosha. I do think something that could potentially be interesting to do is, I mean, advocating for, he did cross state lines to get here. So clearly there was intent. So maybe there might be some federal prosecution that could happen. But I think the best thing we can do as an elected official at this point, unfortunately, is to advocate publicly against this, but also to ensure that this type of thing doesn't happen again. One of the legislations that I would like to introduce around gun violence is this concept of insurance. If you think about it, everyone who buys a car has to buy insurance because cars kill a lot of people. There was a proposal, I think in San Jose, where they were going to require every gun owner to buy insurance. It's actually a perfect line because it doesn't impede on Second Amendment rights, but it ensures there's like controls and processes, and it could and then the insurance pays out to victims of those crimes as well. And so that's one of the things that I think is a clever way to get around kind of not violating Second Amendment rights, but also ensuring that these types of things don't happen going forward, and projecting that. So that's what we would focus on to help reduce gun violence going forward.
Thank you for sharing that. And that's, I would support you in that legislation for sure. And then the question is, I think I already wove that in about talking about your tech journey. What is your strategy to keep tech in California? So we've had some, exits out of San Francisco, out of the Bay Area. How do we make it, where technology companies still see California, the San Francisco Bay Area as the place to be?
Yeah, I mean, again, like technology is rooted in my family's journey. It was what was necessary for us to make it into the middle class. Like my dad, he built the first router for Cisco. He built the first data center for Google. That's how we were able to come up from being immigrants in a single family home with 3 generations there to actually kind of like getting into the middle class, or 3 generations in student housing. And so that was, so I see technology as it can be a liberating force for a lot of immigrants and migrants to move up to the middle class. I think that there's a couple of things. One is, just not making things worse. Having informed context on legislation that doesn't become a hindrance on technology. An example is a lot of the things I've seen in the state is that we have well-intentioned policy that just because no one understands how a database or the internet works, it's very bad. So an example was a couple of years ago, the state was looking at a bot bill to ban like malicious bots on the internet. But because they didn't understand how the internet works, the way they wrote the legislation, it would have banned half the internet, kind of defined as long-running services, which is basically half of the internet's software programs. And so if you don't, first is to make sure we don't take a step backwards. The second is, I think a lot of government policy in California has been focused on penalizing new money rather than old money, and inheritance and institutional wealth. And I think we need to shift from, instead of like over focusing on capital gains, which is a penalty on people who create new money and new products out of stock that's owned in companies. And instead, like for instance, at the federal level, you get long-term capital gains benefits if you hold a stock for more than a year. We don't do that in California. So I'd want to actually have the same benefit that the federal government provides for capital gains on stock, which is where a majority of startup employees get their benefits. Make sure we have the same benefit that we have at the federal level to have reduced capital gains rates for taxes for people who've held their state options as well. And then instead focus on more kind of like inheritance and institutional wealth over generations with these like multi-generational billionaire families over a generation. Instead focus on where that wealth is concentrated, because that's where we need to stop the more old generational wealth accumulates, it's a prohibition on immigrants and migrants and the younger generation to succeed. And so we need to more so focus on inheritance wealth and stop focusing on capital gains that affect stock options for startup employees. Those are the two things that we'd focus on to ensure that more tech people can continue to live and work here. Because also, like, whether people like it or not, tech is every job now. Every restaurant business has a website, and all these things are going to impact people, and ensuring we have good policies to affect it.
Cool. So the next question is, so I'll ask the easy one first. Is Haight-Ashbury part of your district?
I believe it is. Look up briefly. It is, yes.
Okay. All right. Farhan, it is. And then the other question is, who all has endorsed you in your race?
Yeah. So the endorsement process has just started. So there's a couple. So they go through. Interesting thing about the endorsement process is there's like questionnaires and interviews, and given the race just started, a lot of that thing is just taking off. So a lot of the endorsements are going to come in January. But we've had a series of different endorsements already. For instance, AOC's campaign manager and the author of the Green New Deal, Shoika Chakrabarti, who worked on our Green New Deal policy as well. He's endorsed us. He's obviously won. So he's helped support, obviously, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar through that kind of like framework. And so he helped discover and promote their campaigns. And so he's helping us from an outsider perspective as well. We were endorsed by another officially Democratic chartered club called SWANA, which is the first and only kind of Southwest Asian, Arab American, North African Muslim group in San Francisco. So we were officially endorsed by that club in San Francisco as well as Grow SF, which is a group of technologists in San Francisco that are trying to make a better city that's livable for everyone. So those are some of the groups and individuals that have already endorsed us. We've had a lot of grassroots organizers endorse us as well, and native to the San Francisco community. But those are kind of like the existing endorsements we've had so far in this context.
And then what legislation will you champion? I know you've talked about a couple. Is there anything else you would like to share? Yeah,
so I think the way I approach our campaign and how we'll govern is that there's three to four priorities we want to focus on, and they all tie into what's necessary to preserve the middle class and social mobility and upward mobility experience in California, broadly the world. And we want to solve those in a short-term and a long-term capacity. So the issues that we want to focus on are the beacons of the foundation of what enables the middle class. It's housing, schools, it's transit, and climate, because that's the existential threat in that context. And so what we'll immediately do when we get into office is there's a lot of quick changes you can do to affect each of those things. For housing, we want to ensure that the people who are immediately getting evicted, 20% of people are homeless because they're getting evicted, put better protections to ensure that you can't evict someone within a couple of years of taking over a building. And that will help to protect people who are already here. But also to immediately boost guaranteed income. A lot of people can't afford to pay rent. So there's an earned income tax credit that already exists in California. We would boost it from the current level it's at now to give $500 a month to anyone who has below $70,000 in household income. That will immediately enable it for people to actually live with kind of compassion and be able to live in the city that's getting very expensive. For transit, it's been really difficult for people to get around in San Francisco because our bus system has a structural deficit. So we immediately inject cash to close the structural deficit so the public transit system can work in San Francisco as well. For schools, our schools also have a structural deficit. And so we closed that. But also one really shocking thing is that in San Francisco, they removed algebra from being taught from middle school. And as a result, the level of adoption of calculus in high school has dropped significantly, especially amongst people of color. And we would focus on resurrecting that because at the state now they're evaluating the same thing. And for a lot of immigrants, being able to take advanced math is a ticket to move up and advance in society. And so we want to make sure we bring that back and make sure that doesn't happen at the state level as well. And for climate, because that's an existential threat that affects you whether you're in Pakistan or all the way in California. California is the 5th largest economy in the world. It's a strong contributor to emissions. We want to set up a new type of Green New Deal that we've developed in conjunction with AOC's campaign manager and who authored the Green New Deal as well, which would give zero interest green loans to every individual up to $100,000 to retrofit their house, their building, their factory, buy an electric car, buy an electric bike. That will immediately able to us reduce the 60% of emissions that are coming from California's, from those sources of emissions. And so those are the immediate things we would do to ensure that that dream of the immigrant experience, the middle class experience can be resurrected, is by focusing on those policies immediately.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So one of the questions is that being a Pakistani American, is that a liability? Is that something, you have to downplay, or how does that work?
No, I don't think it's a liability. I think, look, San Francisco is like 40% first, second, third generation immigrants, especially in the district that we're in. They're Asian American, they're Latin American, or from a wide range of different countries. And I found in talking to people on the ground in our campaign that they resonate with that experience. A lot of people are first, second generation, and the experience that we had as Pakistani Americans immigrating to this country was like 3 generations in a single bedroom, where we had to take public transit, where we went through public schools. That's a very common experience that people relate to. So I don't think it's been a liability. It's actually been a strength, and it's something that people have recognized. I'm also the only Asian American in the race more broadly. And it's something that people recognize and have been empathetic to and really want to get involved with. So it hasn't been a liability. If I was running in Texas, maybe it would be a liability, unfortunately, but thankfully we're in San Francisco. So.
Thank you. And so I guess one of the questions is, what are some of the ideas you have around solving the housing crisis in San Francisco Bay Area?
Yeah, so I think the way to look at the housing crisis, it's multifactorial. There's a lot of, first you have to distill down, like, why are people homeless? And then why can't we help people who are also moving into the city? And so I think the problem with San Francisco politics conversation on housing is that it tends to focus on one or the other, people who are moving in or people who are already here. And I think our housing policy focuses on both. You have to help people who are already here, a lot of people of color who are being priced out and have to move out. We have to help to ensure that they stay here. But we also have to ensure that people like my parents, if they came here today, could they move and live here as well? And so we need to bridge those components. So to protect people here today, we need stronger renter protections. And ensure, like I mentioned earlier, that if people are getting evicted, that we control those processes so you can't evict someone as soon as the building has been taken over, to ensure that people can remain. On helping people come here, we need to build more housing. We need to build more housing at all levels. In San Francisco, the problem is that most of the district on the west side, it's not zoned to allow people to build more housing. We have exclusionary zoning practices which set height limits on what you can build, or even single family home limits. And so we need to ensure that we allow building of all heights at all levels. And that's one of the things we would do to extend upon policy that's already been implemented in the legislature. Another thing we'd focus on is also, even if you can build higher, it takes a long time to build. So how do we actually ensure that the cost to build is more cheaper and the time to build is shorter as well, so we can help people build as fast as possible? So that's incentivizing things through modular housing, as well as through permitting infrastructure to reform that as well. And so that's kind of like the two-pronged approach we take, is basically enabling us to build housing at all levels, close to transit, at any height, also reducing the time to build through legislation at a top-down framework, but also protecting people who are already here so they don't get kicked out of their homes.
And then obviously the homelessness crisis. You can't have a conversation about San Francisco anymore without talking about how bad homelessness has gotten there.
Yeah, I mean, I live 2 blocks from the Tenderloin. I see it every day as I walk by in the tent encampments. The problem in San Francisco with homelessness is we keep trying the same ideas over and over again. It's not a money problem, it's an ideas problem. we focused a lot on housing first, which is important. I like to say we need a housing plus approach, not just a housing first. And so the program we're going to implement and promote is a system called Built for Zero. It's a system that has solved chronic homelessness in 14 US cities across the country. We just haven't tried it here in San Francisco yet. What it does, and again, this is actually probably an example again where technology background comes into place to understand the effect. It's two-part solution. A, you have a real-time data monitoring system like the census, which monitors every unhoused, where they are, what's their current health status, where are they based, what's their name, what's their history, and tracks their progress over time. It's coupled with personalized care and services, where you bring a counselor to every individual to come to them. I've talked to several people who have come out of homelessness. One of the primary problems is they didn't know where to get services. They didn't know where there was beds. They didn't know where to get healthcare. No one ever told them. They didn't know where to get it. And imagine all of us have applied for jobs before. How hard is it to apply for a job without help? Imagine how hard it is to apply for a job when you're homeless, to get out of homelessness. And so this brings personalized care to every individual. It's expensive, but in San Francisco, we're already spending $1 billion next year on homelessness. So we don't have a money problem, we have an ideas problem. And that's how we would solve it, is using a system that's actually worked, combines technology and personalized care to actually bring accessible services to the individual and actually solve this problem head first.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's such an important thing for everybody to hear. So now let's come to how much are you looking to raise? How can the community best support you, both financially and if you need volunteering or any other way? So what is your ask?
Yeah, so the race just started, but we're doing really well. We have raised over $300,000 in the first month. Our goal is to get to $450, $500 by the end of the year, so in a month and a half. If we continue along our trajectory, that should make it well. So the community support there will be super helpful. And for context, like we're going up against an establishment in San Francisco that has been in office for decades. They've been in office for decades, and still the outcomes of the city have gotten worse. They have not been pro-housing. The opioid epidemic has gotten worse. Businesses have closed, and either some of them are very nice people, but they just don't seem to be able to solve these problems. And so the stakes are really high, and that's why I'm running. But they do have a lot of establishment contacts and establishment money that they get. So we're working outside of that network. We're bringing in so many different people who've never engaged in SF politics before. And that's kind of the beauty of this campaign. So donations are definitely very helpful. I can put a link in our chat afterward as well. But any contribution helps a lot. Only restriction is you have to be either a green card holder or a US citizen, but you can live anywhere in the country or the world as long as you're a citizen or a green card holder in the States. But that will be extremely helpful to help us continue to advance into the next stage. And one of the benefits here is, again, it's a top 2 primary. And so as an outsider, we have a very strong likelihood of winning. Someone had a question about polling. I saw one of the beauties, different polls have us coming in that second position in different polls, not even our polls, other people's polls. And so what that shows is that, like, because the establishment are splitting their votes, it makes it really possible for a third party to come in and win. And stakes are really high. We'd be the first Pakistani, the first Muslim elected in the entire state of California. And it's a really high and important election to actually get that impact going. And so every donation really helps directly translate into votes that we'll be able to get over time. So.
Awesome. Anything else, Bilal, that I may not have asked and you would like to share or talk about your campaign?
No, I mean, I think broadly, it's a very exciting campaign. If you live in San Francisco, definitely sign up on our website to volunteer as well. We've had so much encouraging excitement. Like, we're on the canvas every day. If you're around, we're going to be door knocking later this afternoon if you want to join me if you're in San Francisco. But we'll be canvassing every day with a little break for Thanksgiving. But it's very exciting to be on this campaign. And the impact we'll have is it's going to have repercussions for the next decade. We have 5 to 8 years left to address things like immigration and climate change. We're going to have a really bad year in the House at the federal level next year. Unfortunately, Democrats will probably lose the House again. And so the stakes are really high to prove that Democrats can run effectively. And unless we prove that San Francisco can be a beacon of hope for immigrants and people like my parents, and that people can come here and have a thriving life and move into the middle class in the next couple of years, we're going to get a further reaction to the right nationally, because everyone looks to San Francisco as a model for efficacy on policy. And so if we don't prove that we can be successful here, that's going to be pretty damning. And I think something that's interesting is that if you look nationally, a lot of Democrats lost. But there was some the Democrats who won were Muslims. In New York, in Michigan, there was a very consistent trend around that happening. And so I think that shows that, some of them were Desi as well, that shows that it's the right Democrat who needs to win this to show efficacy. And that's people with our background. And so your support in ensuring that we are able to win and prove that model continuously. There's a change happening in the country, and I think we can show that's happening in San Francisco as well with your support.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. I know at least of Shama and Sadaf who, made it to state assembly in New Jersey, and that's a trend, right? I have friends asking me, even my Jewish friends, like, why is there no Muslim right now in the California State Assembly? Which, for a state like California, right, we're really lagging behind. Considering, what our population is like. So really, proud of you for jumping in, for, taking one of the most important assembly districts. I would say this is key. Everybody's paying attention to it. And I know it's going to take a lot of hard work on your end, and it will take a lot of community support from all of us. To make sure that we support you in every which way is possible for us, by donating, by canvassing with you. If anybody's looking for a good workout, nothing better than canvassing the hills of San Francisco, right? Door knocking. And one of the things, right, I've always paid attention to when statistics going, when you knock on somebody's door, the chances of them voting for you become, 7x more. Because now they know somebody came to their door and said, this candidate is, is serious about it. And then, when you have immigrant population that sometimes doesn't want to get involved in the process either, right? They're like, yeah, we don't care. Somebody else is making the decision. So someone like yourself, being a face which people can connect with and say, okay, he looks a little bit like us, or represents something which we identify with, I think does make a difference. And you really have a pulse on the issues and a strategy for how we solve some of them, which, again, like you said, it's people look at San Francisco, people talk about San Francisco. And these are the issues people are talking nationally about San Francisco. So I really appreciate you talking about all of those. I just want to say thank you so much. There's a comment saying thank you for running and inspiring all of us. We'll be rooting for your success, and I hope everybody comes together. I did drop your website in there. I think you also dropped the donation link in the chat. And so best of luck. Look forward, watching your race and praying and rooting for your success.
Thanks, Sabina. I appreciate the conversation, and thanks everyone here as well. Thanks for joining on a Saturday weekend. But yeah, assalamu alaikum, everyone.
All right. Hafiz.